Let's talk about one of the oddest welcome to the countries we've seen in recent history. This was at the AFLW women's football match, where the welcome was not so much of a welcome or even an acknowledgement, so much as a lecture, indeed not even really a lecture, just a haranguing, on indigenous incarceration. Here's what the welcome was.
I wish to briefly draw attention to a national crisis affecting Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children and young people in youth detention. Our children remain disproportionately represented in these systems and are often too treated not as children, young people deserving care, protection and opportunity, but as a number within the structures that serve political and economic interests rather than community wellbeing. If you wish to discuss this, catch up with me afterwards. Here's my business card.
Now, of course, this welcome to country was labelled as slightly odd or bizarre. In particular, Warren Mundine picked this up on Sky News, and he said the following.
It is a shocker. Look, whether you like welcome to countries or not, when you're doing it, it should, they should go to the dictionary and learn what welcome is. It is about, welcoming people, thanking them, saying, when I was Deputy Mayor of Dubbo and Acting Mayor, when we did citizen ceremonies, when we finished the official part, I used to say, thank you for choosing Australia, thank you for wanting to become citizens and playing a role in making this country a better country. And I say, welcome you to this country. That's what a welcome a country is. It is not about, running your own political program and trying to get out there and promote your business with a business card.
So, there we go. This was a slightly odd welcome to country. Now, there are a whole host of issues, one of which is that this was not so much a welcome or an acknowledgement or really anything that was actually to do with football. Rather, it was a haranguing on indigenous incarceration. So to some extent, it was a little bit out of place for where it was. Furthermore, the person doing the welcome offered up her business card, which is a little bit odd because no one in the crowd is exactly able to go and pick up her business card when she's literally in the middle of the field. So I'm not totally sure what she was trying to achieve, unless she thought that the cameras were going to zoom in on the business card and pick up her details. Whereupon, she'd probably just be inundated with all manner of spam. Still, let's focus on what she was saying, because aside from this not really being a welcome, not really being an acknowledgement, and more being just a lecture or a diatribe, let's have a look at whether she had a point about indigenous incarceration. And here there's probably two overarching issues. Firstly, indigenous Australians are in fact incarcerated at a higher rate in general than non-indigenous Australians. For example, according to the Australian Bureau of Statistics, there were about 17,000 Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander prisoners, and this was an increase of 2% from the March quarter of 2025 and an increase of 11% from the June quarter of 2024. Furthermore, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander prisoners accounted for 37% of all persons in custody. That's a rather hefty percentage, and indeed, just basic arithmetic tells us that there's a higher incarceration rate amongst Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people than amongst the general population. However, we can't just stop at the incarceration rate. We need to ask ourselves, okay, how would this split by socioeconomic status, which we don't really have the data on, but also, more pointedly, were there wrongful incarcerations or incarcerations that were for too long a time? Because that, I think, is really the issue. The incarceration rate is, in my opinion, neither here nor there. What is relevant was, should the people have been in jail? For example, if the person had committed a violent offence, then generally they should be in jail. Obviously, they serve their sentence and then are released, assuming they behave appropriately in prison. Now, what that welcome to country skipped over was whether the people should have been in prison. That is, did they commit the crimes that they were incarcerated for, and were the sentences appropriate? If the person wants to make a point that these people were wrongly convicted, maybe they were verbaled by police, or maybe there was something along those lines where they were incarcerated, where a non-Indigenous person would not have been incarcerated, or something along those lines, then she is free to make that point with evidence. However, simply pointing to incarceration rates doesn't tell us that, because if these people, these 17,000 people, did commit the crime and they were sentenced appropriately, then there isn't wrongful incarceration. There are criminals being put into prison. Now, I'm sure that some people might have been wrongly convicted. Indeed, some people might have admitted incorrectly to a crime that they did not in fact commit because they felt as if they were pressured or whatever the case might be. And indeed, that has gotten less bad recently, but certainly historically, there were problems associated with that. Certainly there were wrongful incarcerations. Certainly there were incarcerations that were for too long a time. Certainly there has been bad behaviour in the police. Just look at the myriad royal commissions that we have all seen. And indeed, many of us are slightly nonplussed by how the police behaved during COVID. So it is not a large extrapolation to believe that some police might have behaved inappropriately, leading to inappropriate incarcerations or prison sentences that were too long, or in other ways slightly wrongful. However, that point needs to be made if they're going to be talking about incarceration rates. But they need to produce actual evidence that these incarcerations were wrongful and that people should not be in prison. There might also be a case that perhaps rehabilitation might have worked better than these prison sentences. That's a case that could be made, but it needs to be made again with evidence. I.e., if someone has been incarcerated for a violent offence, then you can't just release them willy-nilly into the community. There is clearly going to be a prison sentence. Now, the person doing that welcome to country is certainly welcome to produce evidence that these prison sentences were excessive, or it could have been handled better, or whatever the case might be. But like I've said, the incarceration rate does not tell us that, particularly when we're focusing on recent incarcerations, because more recently and over time, there's been less racism, less misconduct in police, and the like. So therefore, the recent incarcerations are telling. So for example, if incarcerations have gone up 11% since the June quarter of 2024, well, they can't all be wrongful incarcerations. And if that is the assertion, well, it really needs to be backed up. Again, to reiterate, the incarceration rate amongst Indigenous Australians is significantly higher. For example, the Australian Bureau of Statistics does report that the imprisonment rate was 217 people per 100,000 of the adult population. That's overall anyway. Now, it is significantly higher for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. For example, for men, it's 4,715 per 100,000 people, and for women, it's 535 per 100,000 people. In essence, the incarceration rate is at least, and I say at least because it is clearly more double than that of the non-Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander population. But again, to reiterate, that doesn't mean that the people here were wrongly incarcerated. And part of it could come down to socioeconomic status. For example, if we're able to perhaps run a regression, we're able to perhaps identify incarceration rates versus things such as ethnicity and socioeconomic status, it could well be that after you control for things like that, then the status of being a particular ethnicity is not as much of a determinant of incarceration so much as myriad other factors. But again, that requires actual analysis. Something that I don't really have the data on here to be able to do that because the ABS just gives you summary statistics. So what does this tell us about the welcome to country? Well, it tells us the welcome to country was misplaced. That is, there's a valid argument about whether it was actually appropriate to harangue people about Indigenous incarceration at a welcome to country. There was also an argument about whether it was a bizarre welcome to country. That is, for example, the person offering up their business card. But also there's a bigger point about, even if we leave those aside, whether there was a valid point about incarceration. I will of course leave it with the fact that if the Indigenous incarceration rate is that high, clearly there is an issue that needs to be resolved. But the issue is not necessarily people trying to incarcerate Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. The issue is not necessarily racism. The issue is not necessarily people being discriminated against. There might be broader issues about the precursors that might induce someone into going into crime, maybe a lack of jobs or perhaps bad influences in a particular location such as Alice Springs that create a self-perpetuating cycle. There are issues that perhaps need to be resolved, but those issues are not seemingly the ones that the person doing the welcome to country was talking about. She was seemingly alluding to or at least implying, that the incarcerations were due to inherent discrimination. But the statistics, at least as they have been presented, don't seem to actually bear that argument out. So much as perhaps disadvantage leading to crime and the like, but that is a separate issue entirely from what the person doing the Welcome to Country was alluding to. Anyway, that was one of the strangest Welcome to Countries we've seen recently. You can let me know your thoughts about it in the comments below, and otherwise, hopefully I'll see you next time as well.